The manila folder appeared on Barry Goldwater's Senate desk on a gray March morning in 1969, nestled between routine committee reports and constituent correspondence. No cover memo explained its presence. No aide claimed responsibility for placing it there. Inside, Goldwater found photocopied documents that would shatter his faith in the presidency he had helped create and force him to confront the most painful decision of his political career. The first page bore the letterhead of the White House Office of the President, dated the 28th of February 1969, just 6 weeks after Richard Nixon's inauguration. The memo's subject line sent chills down Goldwater's spine. Operation Sandwedge. Internal Security Enhancement Program. What followed was a detailed blueprint for the systematic surveillance of Nixon's political opponents, including prominent conservative critics who had dared to question the new president's policies. If you think Watergate was Nixon's first abuse of power, think again. Subscribe and hit that bell to learn the hidden stories they don't teach in history class. And tell me in the comments, should Goldwater have exposed this earlier? Let's uncover the truth about Nixon's secret war on democracy. Barry Goldwater had known Richard Nixon for over 2 decades, had watched him evolve from ambitious House member to vice president, to failed presidential candidate, to triumphant president. They shared conservative principles, anti-communist convictions, and the battle scars that came from challenging the liberal establishment. Goldwater had even endorsed Nixon in 1968, believing that his former colleague would restore dignity and constitutional governance to the White House after the chaos of the Johnson years. Now, staring at documents that revealed Nixon's willingness to weaponize government power against American citizens, Goldwater felt the bitter sting of betrayal. The man he had trusted to uphold constitutional principles was planning to violate those principles more systematically than any president in American history. The memo's author was John Ehrlichman, Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor, writing to Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman with the clinical precision of someone accustomed to discussing morally questionable activities in bureaucratic language. Per our discussion of February 25th, Ehrlichman wrote, "We have identified multiple categories of individuals whose activities require enhanced monitoring to protect presidential initiatives and maintain political stability. The categories were chilling in their scope. Category 1, Democratic opposition figures with potential to organize effective resistance to administration policies. Category 2, media personalities whose coverage patterns suggest coordinated opposition to presidential priorities. Category 3, Republican dissidents, whose criticism undermines party unity and presidential authority." It was Category 3 that struck Goldwater like a physical blow. Nixon was not content to spy on Democrats and hostile journalists. He was planning to conduct surveillance on members of his own party who had the audacity to disagree with his policies. The memo specifically mentioned conservative senators whose independent positions on foreign policy and domestic spending threatened administration legislative priorities. Goldwater didn't need to guess which conservative senators were being targeted. He had already criticized Nixon's willingness to expand federal spending, had questioned the administration's approach to Vietnam withdrawal, and had expressed concerns about Nixon's apparent comfort with big government solutions to domestic problems. In Nixon's paranoid mind, principled conservative opposition was apparently indistinguishable from democratic sabotage. The second document in the folder was even more disturbing, a detailed operational plan for implementing the surveillance program. Authored by someone identified only as JC, the document outlined methods for gathering intelligence on targeted individuals that went far beyond anything Goldwater had imagined possible in a democratic society. Phase 1 operations will focus on electronic surveillance of home and office communications. The operational plan explained with chilling matter-of-factness. Targets include telephone intercepts, mail monitoring, and when feasible, audio surveillance of private meetings and social gatherings. Phase 2 will expand to include financial investigations designed to identify potential vulnerabilities or improprieties that might be used to neutralize opposition activities. Banking records, investment portfolios, business dealings, and tax returns will be examined for any irregularities that might compromise targets' credibility or effectiveness. Phase 3 involves proactive measures to disrupt opposition activities through strategic information deployment, creation of internal conflicts within target organizations, and coordination with friendly media outlets to ensure negative coverage of opposition figures. As Goldwater read the clinical descriptions of activities that violated every constitutional principle he held sacred, he realized that Nixon was not planning isolated acts of political surveillance. He was creating a comprehensive domestic intelligence operation designed to eliminate effective opposition to presidential power. This was not politics as usual. This was the systematic destruction of democratic accountability. The third document provided operational details that made clear the program's sophisticated planning and extensive resources. Current personnel assignments include 12 full-time operatives with backgrounds in military intelligence and corporate security, the document explained. Equipment procurement is proceeding through channels that ensure deniability while maintaining operational effectiveness. The document continued with logistical details that revealed the operation's scope and ambition. Target list currently includes 47 individuals across 12 states. Priority 1 targets require daily monitoring. Priority 2 targets require weekly assessment. Priority 3 targets require monthly review unless circumstances warrant elevation to higher priority status. Goldwater's name appeared on the Priority 1 list, along with other conservative senators who had shown independence from Nixon administration positions. The designation meant that his phone calls were being recorded, his mail was being opened, and his private meetings were potentially being monitored by government agents working for a president who claimed to represent conservative principles. The violation felt deeply personal, but it also represented something larger and more dangerous than individual privacy concerns. Nixon was using government power to eliminate legitimate political opposition, transforming the presidency from a constitutional office into an instrument of authoritarian control. The very democracy that conservatives sought to preserve was being destroyed by a president who claimed to defend it. That afternoon, Goldwater walked the halls of the Capitol with a weight of terrible knowledge pressing down on him. Every conversation now carried the possibility of surveillance. Every phone call might be recorded. Every private meeting could be compromised by hidden microphones or informants. The paranoia was itself a form of victory for Nixon's operation. Even knowing about the surveillance changed behavior and inhibited the free exchange of ideas that democracy required. But Goldwater's concerns went beyond personal violation to encompass the fundamental health of American democracy. If Nixon could successfully eliminate conservative opposition within his own party, what would prevent him from expanding the program to include any critic, any journalist, any citizen who dared to question presidential power? The precedent being established threatened to transform America into a surveillance state where political opposition existed only at the sufferance of whoever controlled the White House. That evening, Goldwater called a private meeting with two of his most trusted Senate colleagues, John Tower of Texas and Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. Both men were conservative Republicans who had supported Nixon's election but maintained their independence on policy matters. If Goldwater's suspicions were correct, both men were likely targets of Nixon's surveillance program. The meeting took place in Tower's Senate office after hours, when the Capitol building was nearly empty and the chances of surveillance were presumably reduced. Even so, Goldwater found himself speaking in whispers as he shared the contents of the mysterious folder with his colleagues. Tower's response was immediate and visceral. "Jesus Christ, Barry, are you telling me that Nixon is spying on Republican senators?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Goldwater replied grimly. "And not just spying planning to use whatever they find to neutralize anyone who doesn't toe the party line." Thurmond, with his decades of experience in Washington's bare-knuckle politics, grasped the implications immediately. "This is worse than anything Johnson ever did. At least LBJ was honest about his ruthlessness. Nixon is claiming to restore constitutional government while systematically undermining the Constitution." The three senators spent the next 2 hours analyzing the documents and discussing their options. Exposing the surveillance program would require them to reveal classified information, potentially violating federal law. It would also mean declaring war on a Republican president just weeks into his presidency, damaging their own party's credibility and handing Democrats a powerful weapon for the upcoming midterm elections. But remaining silent meant accepting the transformation of the presidency into an instrument of authoritarian control. It meant abandoning their constitutional responsibilities as senators to provide oversight of executive power. Most importantly, it meant betraying the principles that had brought them to Washington in the first place. The question, Goldwater said as the meeting drew to a close, is whether we're Republicans first or Americans first, because I don't think we can be both in this situation. Tower nodded grimly. If we expose this, Nixon will destroy us politically. His people will leak every piece of dirt they can find, paint us as disloyal troublemakers who care more about personal grievances than party unity. And if we don't expose it, Thurmond added, we'll be complicit in the death of constitutional government. We'll be the senators who knew about presidential tyranny and chose to protect the tyrant. The meeting ended without resolution, but all three men understood that they faced a decision that would define not just their political careers, but their fundamental character as Americans. They were being forced to choose between party loyalty and constitutional principle, between personal safety and democratic survival. Over the following weeks, Goldwater conducted his own investigation into Operation Sandwedge, using his position on the Senate Armed Services Committee to make discreet inquiries about the program's personnel and resources. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears and revealed new dimensions of Nixon's assault on democratic accountability. The operation was far larger and more sophisticated than the initial documents had suggested. Military intelligence officers had been reassigned to domestic surveillance duties in violation of federal law. CIA personnel were providing technical assistance despite legal prohibitions on domestic operations. FBI resources were being diverted from legitimate law enforcement to political surveillance activities. Most disturbing was the program's apparent coordination with private security firms that provided plausible deniability for the most legally questionable activities. Corporate investigators could conduct surveillance that government agents couldn't legally perform, creating a shadow intelligence apparatus that operated beyond constitutional constraints or democratic oversight. Goldwater's investigation also revealed that Operation Sandwedge was just the beginning of Nixon's plans for using government power against political opponents. Internal memos referenced future phases that would expand surveillance to include journalists, civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and anyone else who threatened Nixon's political interests. The president was systematically building the infrastructure for authoritarian rule while maintaining the facade of constitutional governance. The evidence was overwhelming, but it also presented Goldwater with an impossible choice. Exposing Operation Sandwedge would require him to reveal classified information, potentially making him vulnerable to criminal prosecution. It would also require him to destroy a Republican president, handing Democrats control of the White House and potentially undoing the conservative gains that had taken decades to achieve. But the alternative was accepting the transformation of America into a surveillance state, where political opposition existed only at the president's discretion. It meant watching constitutional government die while maintaining the appearance of democratic institutions. For Barry Goldwater, who had spent his career arguing that principles mattered more than political expediency, the choice was ultimately clear. On the 15th of April, 1969, Goldwater requested a private meeting with President Nixon in the Oval Office. He told Nixon's staff that he wanted to discuss matters of mutual interest regarding constitutional governance and presidential authority. He did not mention that he intended to give Nixon one last chance to abandon his surveillance program before facing public exposure. The meeting began with the usual political pleasantries, discussions of legislative priorities, political developments in Arizona, and mutual friends in the conservative movement. But Nixon's demeanor suggested he suspected this was not a routine visit from a supportive colleague. The president's characteristic awkwardness was more pronounced than usual, and his conversation seemed forced and stilted. "Mr. President," Goldwater finally said when they had exhausted small talk, "I've received some information that troubles me greatly. Information about government surveillance of American citizens for political purposes. Nixon's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed, his jaw tightened, and his eyes took on the defensive wariness that characterized him when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Barry, I hope you're not suggesting that my administration would engage in improper surveillance activities. We're committed to restoring law and order while respecting constitutional principles. Mr. President, Goldwater replied carefully, I'm not making suggestions. I'm sharing factual information about a program called Operation Sandwedge that appears to involve systematic surveillance of your political opponents, including members of your own party. The name hit Nixon like a physical blow. His careful composure cracked completely, revealing the paranoid, calculating mind that would eventually destroy his presidency. For a moment, the President of the United States looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been caught red-handed violating his oath of office. I don't know what you're talking about, Nixon said, but his voice lacked any conviction. Goldwater pulled out photocopies of the key documents and placed them on Nixon's desk. Mr. President, these documents detail plans for surveillance and harassment of American citizens whose only crime is disagreeing with your policies. This includes conservative Republicans who support you personally, but maintain independent positions on specific issues. Nixon stared at the documents without picking them up, his face cycling through emotions that revealed his internal struggle between defensiveness and calculation. Finally, he looked up at Goldwater with the expression of a cornered animal. Barry, you've been in Washington long enough to understand how things really work. Every president faces opposition that goes beyond legitimate political disagreement. There are people actively working to undermine American interests, to sabotage policies that are vital to national security. Sometimes protecting democracy requires measures that seem undemocratic to people who don't understand the full scope of the threats we face. The response revealed everything Goldwater needed to know about Nixon's mindset. The president genuinely believed that political opposition represented a threat to national security, that criticism of his policies was tantamount to sabotage, that constitutional limitations on presidential power were obstacles to effective governance rather than foundations of democratic society. Mr. President, Goldwater said, with a moral authority that had made him a conservative icon. What you're describing isn't democracy, it's tyranny. When presidents start treating political opposition as treason, when they use government power to silence criticism, when they abandon constitutional principles in the name of protecting democracy, they become the very threat to American freedom that they claim to be fighting. Nixon's response was pure calculation dressed up as patriotic duty. Barry, sometimes leaders have to make difficult choices that history will vindicate. Sometimes protecting democracy requires temporary restrictions on those who would destroy it. I'm asking for your support. Your understanding that the presidency requires tools that senators don't need and authorities that Congress doesn't possess. No, Goldwater replied with finality that surprised them both. I won't support this, Mr. President. I won't be complicit in the destruction of constitutional government, regardless of the justifications you offer. This program needs to be shut down immediately, or I'll be forced to make it public. The ultimatum hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Nixon understood that Goldwater possessed both the information and the credibility to destroy his presidency before it had barely begun. But he also understood that abandoning his surveillance program would leave him vulnerable to the very opposition that the program was designed to neutralize. You're making a mistake, Barry, Nixon said with a cold calculation that would eventually doom his presidency. You're putting personal principles ahead of practical necessities. You're risking everything we've worked for, everything the conservative movement has achieved, for the sake of abstract constitutional theories that don't account for the real threats we face. Goldwater stood up, his decision crystallized by Nixon's response. Mr. President, if conservatism means abandoning the Constitution to accumulate power, then I'm not a conservative. If the Republican Party stands for unlimited presidential authority rather than limited government, then I'm in the wrong party. Principles aren't abstract theories, they're the foundations of everything we claim to believe. The meeting ended with both men understanding that their political relationship was permanently severed. Nixon had revealed his willingness to use any means necessary to eliminate opposition and accumulate power. Goldwater had chosen constitutional principle over party loyalty and personal safety. As Goldwater walked through the West Wing toward his waiting car, he carried with him the knowledge that he had probably signed his own political death warrant. Nixon would undoubtedly use every resource at his disposal to destroy the senator who had dared to threaten his surveillance program. The files that Operation Sandwedge had already compiled would be weaponized against him, and new investigations would be launched to find anything that might be used to discredit his warnings about presidential tyranny. But Goldwater also carried with him something more important than political survival, the certainty that he had chosen correctly when forced to decide between party loyalty and constitutional principle. The conservative movement would survive Nixon's authoritarianism, but only if conservative leaders were willing to oppose tyranny, regardless of its partisan affiliation. Over the following months, Goldwater's warnings about Operation Sandwedge proved prophetic in ways he had not anticipated. The surveillance program was indeed shut down, but only to be replaced by more sophisticated operations that would eventually culminate in the Watergate scandal. Nixon's paranoia and willingness to abuse government power would grow rather than diminish, ultimately destroying his presidency and damaging the Republican Party for a generation. The mysterious folder that had appeared on Goldwater's desk was never explained, but its contents had provided an early warning about the authoritarian tendencies that would define Nixon's presidency. Whether the documents came from a whistleblower within the administration, a concerned intelligence officer, or someone else entirely, they had served their purpose alerting constitutional conservatives to the threat posed by their own president. Goldwater's confrontation with Nixon in the Oval Office represented more than a policy disagreement between Republican leaders. It represented the fundamental tension between conservative ideology and authoritarian impulses, between limited government principles and unlimited presidential ambition. When those tensions could not be reconciled, Goldwater had chosen principle over party, constitution over convenience. The decision would define the remainder of his Senate career and establish his reputation as the conservative leader who had been willing to oppose tyranny even when it wore a Republican label. When the Watergate scandal finally exposed Nixon's abuse of power to public scrutiny, Goldwater would be among the senators who demanded the president's resignation, citing not partisan advantage, but constitutional necessity. Years later, as Watergate investigators uncovered the full scope of Nixon's surveillance activities, Goldwater would remember the manila folder that had warned him about Operation Sandwedge. The program that Nixon had described as necessary for national security had indeed been the first step toward the systematic abuse of presidential power. The surveillance apparatus that began with monitoring political opponents had eventually expanded to include break-ins, burglaries, and cover-ups that brought down a presidency. Goldwater's early warning about Nixon's authoritarian tendencies had been vindicated by history, but at enormous cost to his own political position and to the conservative movement he had helped create. The man who had been nominated for president as the conservative alternative to liberal governance had been forced to oppose a Republican president who claimed to represent conservative principles. The irony was not lost on Goldwater, but neither was the lesson. Constitutional government required eternal vigilance, not just against liberal overreach, but against conservative authoritarianism. Principles mattered more than party labels, and democracy survived only when leaders were willing to sacrifice political advantage for constitutional principle. The Nixon trap had been sprung not just on American democracy, but on the conservative movement that had trusted a Republican president to govern according to constitutional limits. Goldwater's decision to resist that trap, to choose principle over party loyalty, had helped preserve the possibility that conservatism might eventually find leaders who actually believed in limiting government power rather than simply redirecting it toward conservative purposes. In the end, the manila folder and its disturbing contents had presented Barry Goldwater with the most important test of his political career. His response to that test, immediate, principled, and costly, had demonstrated that conservative ideology remained viable only when conservative leaders remained committed to the constitutional principles that justified their opposition to liberal governance. The surveillance program that Nixon had defended as necessary for protecting democracy had instead revealed the authoritarian impulses that threatened to destroy it. Goldwater's opposition to that program had helped preserve the constitutional foundations that made genuine conservatism possible, even at the cost of his own political influence and party standing. Barry Goldwater had discovered the Nixon trap before it could fully spring, and his warning had helped prevent the complete transformation of American government into an instrument of authoritarian control. The price of that discovery had been enormous. But the alternative silent complicity in the death of constitutional democracy had been unthinkable for a man who had spent his career arguing that principles mattered more than political expediency.